The series was made possible by a generous donation from the Westridge Foundation, MOAD members, and all of you who join us each time. Thank you so much for your support. My guest today, born as one of 12 children, Sharif Bey was raised in a large African-American family in Pittsburgh. While many of the men in his family left school for jobs in industry, Bey had a pivotal experience at the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, MCG, while attending high school. MCG played a formative role for Bey throughout his teens, giving him a foundation of skills and extensive ceramics world connections. Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, Bey studied sculpture at the Academy of Fine Art and Design in Bratislava, you're gonna have to help me with that one, Slovakia. Later, he earned his BFA from Slippery Rock University, his MFA from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and PhD in art education from Pennsylvania State University. Inspired by modernism, functional pottery, oceanic African art, and art of the African diaspora, Bey's ceramic, glass, mixed media works investigate the cultural and political significance of adornment and the symbolic and formal properties of archetypal motifs, while questioning how the meaning of icons and function transform across cultures and time. His awards include the United States Artist Fellowship, the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, the Pollock-Krasner Fellowship, the J. William Fulbright Scholarship, and University of South Carolina at Greensboro's 2019 Distinguished Alumni Award. His works are featured in several public collections, including the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Columbus Museum, Dallas Museum of Art, the Mint Museum, Crocker Museum, Wichita Museum of Art, the Westmoreland American Art Museum, and the Belger Collection. Bey lives in Syracuse, New York, with his wife and 3 children. Welcome so much, Sharif. How you doing?
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I should say also Ramadan Mabarak to you as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us at this time. It wasn't until we spoke earlier that I realized you've been fasting all day.
Yeah, you get used to it after the first, at least I do, after the first 3 or 4 days. I mean, we're on the downside of it. So it used to be, it's time to break fast, but now I could chill.
You can ease into it, huh?
Sometimes I'm still cooking and my wife taps me on the shoulder and gives me a glass of water and a date, so it's
nice.
Fine.
Nice. That's a wonderful thing for us. So yeah, so just when that moment comes for you, we completely understand. I grew up with a Muslim father. I myself am not Muslim, and that was one of the hardest things for me. Yeah. What did you say? How do you even summarize Sharif Bey's background? Great job. Thank you, Sadeh, for including the CV in the chat. Sharif, yeah, a very impressive CV, by the way. My goodness. And I'm like, oh, I can't wait to go visit your art in the collections, in some of these amazing museums that I've visited. The Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Hirshhorn are some of my favorite museums in the country. Whenever
things have really picked up over the last couple of years. A student said to me the other day, and she was kind of being a little bit of a smart ass. She's like, how could you have done all this stuff? Are you sure you're not lying? You're not making this stuff up. But I've before I became an artist, I was an art kid. So I was, kind of the trajectory was set pretty early. And I just, in that time, you followed a path. Right? This is before social media and all the Black art stardom that didn't exist. There were just some people who were doing it, and I admired them, and I listened to them, and I followed them. Winnie Owens Hart, who was then teaching at Howard University, who's a celebrated African-American artist who spends a lot of time, studying traditional pottery methods on the continent. David McDonald, who's also a celebrated African-American ceramist. We kept in touch. But like I said, I was smart to follow smart people. That's what and everything else kind of came from that. I'm fortunate to be born into a culture of mentorship where we were taught to follow the elders.
That's incredible. So what was your pathway into ceramics? I mean, that's a very particular art form. And I can't, later on, we're going to go into, showing examples of your work for folks who are not familiar, and then also just kind of breaking some of those down. But, when one thinks of ceramics, we're often thinking of utilitarian objects. And you have a history of creating both utilitarian objects, but really emphasizing their function as a vessel and going beyond just the physical, like carrying of water or storing of subsistence objects, but moving into these like spiritual realms with the work. But just what was that start into ceramics? When did you pick up that material and decide this is the one that I want to express myself through the most?
Well, I had a couple of different orientations before it really took. The first one is, as I mentioned to you, I've always been an art kid, and I come from an art family, and I just kind of, there was programs available, and especially, I was born in the 70s and came up in the 80s, and back then there were lots of programs that just unfortunately aren't available today, and a lot of opportunities to travel. The logistics of getting a school bus were not as costly and complicated as they are today. And, we had opportunities to go places if we were interested. So I spent a lot of time in museum programs and pre-college programs, but I went to a creative and performing arts middle school, and I kind of butt heads with our 2D teacher and ended up kind of under the wing of the ceramics teacher. And she wasn't especially experienced in ceramics, but that was her job, and to make facilities available to us. And I didn't have a lot of success in my middle school ceramics in terms of things getting fired. A lot of things blew up, but I did have some modeling chops. And when I went to high school, there was a recruitment through the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, where they're basically trying to bring students to their after-school program. And when I got there and saw what was available in terms of facilities, I mean, kilns large enough for you to stand in.
Wow.
It gave me 25 or 30 pounds of clay the first day I was there. I'd never seen so much clay in my life. I had an interest in clay, but once I saw those facilities available to me, I knew, and it was at that point, the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild in 1988 was kind of the best kept secret, because there were more teachers there than there were students.
Wow.
So I became kind of part of this community of makers. And I have to say, pretty much right on, like, I kind of wanted to keep pace with them. So here I was 14, 15 years old, and I was comparing myself to grad students and postbacks. And in terms of work ethic and quality, I was trying to keep up with them. And it's kind of like, it's funny, it's kind of like me being a kid and having lots of older brothers and sisters.
Sure.
I'm on the younger end of that. So that means that, I learned how to handle myself at a pretty young age. So if you're 12 years old and you're used to wrestling 16-year-olds, and you get confronted with a 14-year-old, you can put him on his ass pretty easily. So,
that's hilarious.
But that's kind of how it was for me in ceramics. So when I got to college, I had like 5 years on most people that I knew. So I was kind of like in grad school mode when I was 18, because I'd already logged in so many hours meeting ceramic artists, attending visiting artist lectures, learning glaze chemistry. And I was really committed to being a ceramic artist when I was 15 years old. That's what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I was blessed to know that so early in my life. And I just, and of course, the thing that I think is kind of amazing is having that foresight and that target. Life kind of folded around it. For a lot of people, it's like, I have to like figure out what I want to do and where my life goes. It's like I was already a committed ceramic artist, and then I had to figure out how to chase girls and go on dates and pass my classes and get a job and, raise a family. But that was already there. It wasn't like I'm interested in this and then I got to stop, wearing the new Jordans and figure out how to not get clay on my clothes. I was already getting clay on my clothes before I had a sense of fashion or what anybody was interested in. So I feel, again, very blessed to have had life kind of fold in on my creative practice, as opposed to me having to kind of like bud within the rocky soil of life, so to speak.
That's incredible. So you said you came from an artistic family or a family that was infused with the arts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Were your parents artists, or did you have other artists, working artists who were making a living like the way that you are?
It's mostly on my dad's side, and most of them, for the most part, could just draw their butts off better than me for the most part. But nobody, in very few occasions did anybody think much of it beyond like a hobby. Like, for example, a cousin of mine, I think he might have been, and he'd been doing it, dabbling here and there, but like he moved into a new place and like, hey, I need to put some things on the wall. He made some paintings. Somebody saw them. Was like, you gotta have a gallery exhibition. Next thing you know, he's having a gallery exhibition, but it was nothing that he ever took really that seriously. But everybody could draw and doodle and had a good sense. My father was an avid wood carver when he was really young. Like, I still have like totems and things he made when he was like 13, 14, 15 that are amazing. But probably the biggest influence is my uncle, who passed away probably about 15 years ago. And he was already retired well before I was a little kid. And he lived directly across the street, and they raised a family of 10 themselves.
Wow.
But if you could imagine like a Black version of Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid, that was my uncle. Like, in terms of like koi ponds, rose vines, gazebos, he arched all the doorways, like Moroccan architecture, murals in his house. He had a pond in his living room. He was just perpetually plaster freezes on the wall. He was perpetually just recreating and creating this kind of like space, like it was always something to do. His den was like a freaking work of art in itself. It should be on like the historical registry. I mean, it's still there. I mean, he's been gone for a while and they're doing their best to maintain it. But that was just, to me, a really amazing thing to grow up with, because it was perpetual. You know what I mean? It was never, it's like by the time you restore the den, it's time to upgrade the kitchen again. You know what I mean? And it was always done with such unique and historical and creative sensibility was always injected into that. And sometimes I would be over there watching, and sometimes that'd help. I remember him making a freaking mold for one of those roses for a freeze, just out of Play-Doh. He started it and just dumped, plaster and casted it out of Play-Doh. I couldn't believe it.
That's incredible to see that kind of thing, because oftentimes when we see art or we see artists working or seeing someone like you who's in the thick of success and shows happening, and being included in all these collections and getting awards, it's hard to be able to see that process. So I think it's really amazing that you grew up and you were able to see that process come through. Now,
well, I'm sorry, I want to add this. So there's the doodler, then there's my uncle, who's a retired hobbyist, but he's really in it. And then you may know of like Raymond Saunders.
Oh, of course.
So Raymond Saunders is from Pittsburgh, and his nephews were a block away from me. So I spent time down there, and a couple of things belonged to Raymond Saunders in his living room, but he was like the artist myth to us. He's out in California. He's in
In
Paris.
Oakland, in Oakland.
Yeah, he's in this country. He's going in Paris and he's doing this. So he was like the Black artist who catapulted to became this like, he was like mythical proportions to us. Like, wow, he's really doing it. Because we didn't know that many Black folk who were making art with a capital A and getting endorsed by these white institutions. And he was one of them back then. So I'm sorry to cut you, but I wanted to make sure I made that distinction because, to me, it's all about demystifying what this is all about, because it's not magic, it's work.
Yeah.
People think it's magic.
I love that you just said research, and I also love that you mentioned Raymond Saunders. Yes, he is. He's a big deal here in the Bay Area. We actually have a work of his on the side of the building of Museum of the African Diaspora. I don't think a lot of folks know about it. It's a little elevated, and he's finally having these solo shows dedicated to his work here in the Bay Area. Because yes, he blew up, but then there's still so much research and recognition, that he's due for his work. But I want to go into the concept of research for your work, and you're dealing with so many either like traditional art forms from Africa or referencing them, I would say, and these are not necessarily purely functional objects. They're not purely art for art's sake objects. They have these deeper histories and deeper meanings to them. You also have your own personal family history and relationship. Can you talk about the role of relationship within your work? What are you investigating, and kind of what are the things that are driving you to create what you create?
Well, I think it's important, like there's content and there's context. And I saw an artist talk recently, and somebody just rolled right in and started talking about the object. And I was like impressed and perturbed at the same time, right? Because for me, it's very difficult to situate a work of art without talking about myself. And specifically, and very timely for this conversation, what it means to have a diasporic identity, right? So, in some ways, there's certain, there's vestiges of ideas that we're trying to connect to, and then sometimes there's questions, and maybe there's like some imposter syndrome associated with like, is this my content? Can I reach back? What will the Africans say? I'm not African, not in the sense of, being born in the Congo or growing up in Uganda, but I have an affinity for these things, and I feel that they're mine. Maybe not mine in the same way, right? But they're mine. And I think that in some regard, we're uniquely positioned as African Americans, because there are those fragments, and in between those fragments are interstices, and those little interstices offer us liberties for interpretation and expansion. The newer term that people throw around a lot is Afrofuturism, right? Is that I'm not going to contest it, but I just found it interesting. You do something, you've been doing something, and then people start calling it something, right? But I think that those interstices are important, because there's that space between. We can't possibly piece together the entire story. So we're creative people. We take liberties. We play on conjecture. We expose the colonizer. These are different things that we can do in place of those untold stories or spaces in between stories. So I know that's real kind of like touchy-feely, but speaking of my own personal autobiography, you know, I'm a potter. You know, I have heritage that connects. You know, I can go back to uh, pre-Great Migration. You know, I can go from Pittsburgh back to Tennessee, and then it gets a little bit foggy
Mm-hmm.
after that. After I get back to the plantation, and that's a lot of time and space to play in some ways. So my method of research is not always about like finding something, and I mean, because this is not, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a historian, I'm an artist.
Mm-hmm.
So what I do with data is very different than what an historian might do with data. And I have some historical research chops. You know, my dissertation dealt with, you know, the Harlem Renaissance, you know, and the idea of, you know, fetish and conjecture of Africa. You know, there was a lot of that where we had artists, you know, Black artists looking to white people to be informed by Africa because the pathway to Africa was not so clear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So prior to, you know, decolonization, before people started traveling to places like Ghana, you know, people would go somewhere like the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia to look at African art, to study African art, and they needed the support, the philanthropic support of white folk to get there. So it's a very different kind of mediated experience than it is today for someone to just go and I find these things and I kind of filter them through my own identity as a sculptor who has a pottery, you know, kind of foundation. So the vessel plays a really important metaphorical role because it's about containment, it's about sustenance, it's about mystery. It's also a strong metaphor for kind of planting one's stake, because civilization was, you know, we're hunters and gatherers until we find out how to sustain these objects, you know, through a sense of, you know, permanence. So in some regard, you know, the vessel is another metaphor for planting one's stake, right? Now we can kind of pitch a tent, so to speak, because we have a way to store what we have. So so all those metaphors, medicinal, you know, play a role. And then of course the vessel as the body as vessel. You know, what are we the keepers of, right? And playing on the orifices of the person as they pertain to or relate to the orifices of a vessel. So so to me, all those things are fodder for filling in the blanks or the journey that is fueled by our efforts to fill in the blanks.
For sure, for sure. You know, you bring up some things. I have a really good friend, Jose, who is a Yoruba priest, or a priest in Ife, and he also is really deeply into researching the origins of the spiritual practices that he's studying and that he's carrying on. And one of the things that he is constantly saying is, you know, in the West, we have these visions of these pure, untainted, you know, African cultures and religions. And he's like, they're like, whatever religion or whatever culture you can think about from the continent, they were informed by something else, you know, and most African peoples have this way of incorporating things that make sense to them, that add on to their belief systems. And so, you know, I think when people try to say like, oh, like, you know, you're not Congo, you're not from that region, what are you doing referencing these things? You know, I think there's a lack of understanding that those objects, those cultures were informed when Europeans came into the continent and interacted with them, those objects changed fundamentally by their interaction with this other culture. And so these things that we like to think of as pure and not moving, and culture not moving is completely untrue. So I love that you think about your objects also in terms of your own religion, your own family's history and migration, and kind of infusing some of those concepts into the deeper meanings of the work that you make.
And it's really a challenging thing because, the word like appropriation, like interestingly, the last lecture I did, and there was a person who was kind of asking really important questions about what is the responsibility to this content? I'm not from there, but also, I'm of color, which I feel like gives me a different authority than somebody who were not, to look back and
Sure.
pull from. It's just that's a whole nother conversation, but it's very different, right? To follow in or to take from. But what do we bring to these experiences? So when something goes from its original context to the flea market, or to the tourist market, or to the museum, or as an object in a still life, like I've seen African so-called, and I'm saying this very generally, Central West African sculpture in these different contexts, and they birth different kinds of meaning. So I'm somebody who's interested in interrogating that, not duplicating it, not taking it forward. But I think, again, one of the important things to me about diasporic practices is that they make room for these iterations, whether it's music or dance, like where time does not stand still. So what does it mean to look at something when you're 18 and then to come back and to look at it again when you're 81, right? It's a different interpretive experience. And what do we bring to that? And what do we take with us? So I'm very interested, in those things. But when I did this most recent talk, coincidentally, there was a brother from the Congo in the audience for the first time.
Wow.
And he came up to me and we had a really great conversation about, these objects. And I mean, he was very supportive of my work, but these works are not just drawing on Nkisi. They also draw on things like memory jugs or memory jars, which are very much kind of a part of the diasporic experience. And some of these objects and traditions that are such an amalgamation of, the transplant, I said time and history and geography. So, there are things that my, late wife's grandmother would do. And she was a strong, God-fearing Baptist woman, but she had adopted practices that were carried over, from probably her grandmother, things that she wouldn't do, things that she was afraid of, things that she thought she should do, the way she swept her front steps, the things she put in her yard. These were things that if she knew what they were, she would think they were sacrilege.
Sure.
Right? With her, it was just things that grandma told her and aunt smacked her for not doing, that she thought she should have her children and her children's children do. Right? So there's a lot of mystery in those things where, we're carrying on traditions and don't even know why sometimes. So I just find it fascinating.
Oh, yes. I talk about those stories within my family always, constantly. It's like, we have those, but those are those special little moments. With also the special memories, the special practices that we have. And I love that in these later generations, we can start to look at them and interrogate them, as you say, and discover what the origins are. I'm gonna, because I could talk to you and talk to you and talk to you. I want to show your work right now. So just give me a second to pull those up really quick. And let's talk about some of your actual pieces in here. We'll start at whoops. This is not where I intended to start at. Let's see. Excuse me for that.
Yeah.
I wanted to start off with the jar. This one, I thank you for allowing me to just kind of go through your work and pick what really spoke to me. This concept of the feather textured jar, or I also see the chevron pattern within that, and
So
the symbol that has so much weight in different contexts.
So speaking of time, this is a series of work called Pots I Wish I Could Have Made in the 90s. And
Really?
and this is probably, I don't know what, I'm gonna guess maybe 2010, something like that. But I've always had an affinity for ceramic surfaces. And interestingly, it started out when I first started making pots, like a young potter would. Their pots were clunky and thick. And because I had some drawing skills, I'd always make the excuse that I'm just going to carve them. That's why I meant to make them this thick and clunky. And over time, of course, the vessels got better in terms of the craftsmanship, and of course the surfaces got more invested. But I've always loved repetition and textile, and it's not something that I've really researched much. It's always been kind of fluid for me. And a lot of people look at these things and they reference, various kinds of pre-Columbian, Native American,
Hmm.
West Central African textiles and textures. But these just kind of evolved over time for me. And this was one of the motifs that I adopted. And I probably tried to do this on a very bad pot a long time ago, and then just revisited, with a more keen eye and a level of patience that I could not have achieved when I was 15, and just revisited these same ideas. So that's the short of that content wise. And
That
there's
that
a bunch of different patterns that reference baskets and feathers and hair and bark. I've always been a student of natural history.
Hmm.
Um, there's a Carnegie Natural History Museum. I've spent a lot of time outside, but I've always loved just that which was already here.
That's incredible. First of all, I just love the title of the series. He said pots you wish you had made in the 90s. That is incredible to me. Oh, did I lose you?
Yeah, so this glaze is from back then. I would have tried to do this same pot and did a very bad job of it. Again, when I was in high school.
That yeah, I love it. I love it. Um, and I jumping into this because this is the series that where I was first introduced to your work. These oversized, monumental jewelry pieces. And oh, go ahead. Yeah, but I just want to say just how beautiful these were, and
Thank you.
I had to know who this artist was when I first discovered these for myself.
Thank you. There's a lot of fun facts about this particular series, but I want to say it started when I was a PhD student. And one of the things that started to happen, circumstantially, I went back to school. I had no intention of going to get a PhD. I was an artist. I was working for a nonprofit, teaching high school kids. My wife had we had just had a baby, so we had a little, and she was expecting. Worst time to go to school. But I got recruited to go back to college, and I took a fellowship to go to Penn State. Reason only because I liked the name Dr. Bey. That was my only motivation that got me in the door, in the door there. At any rate, let's just say you're really, when you're a doctoral student, because you're teaching and doing research and taking classes. And then I couldn't get into the studio to make pots the way I used to make pots. So I started working in a way that would allow for me to make components.
Mm.
And then I can play with those components. Like my wife took, the kids away for spring break or Easter break or winter break to her parents, or the kids were going. But I would make these little pots that I would fire in my fireplace. And over time, they went from being, kind of less stated to more extreme. Around the same time, I came across this calendar called Women of the African Ark. And it had this young, I think there was some necklaces in there. Some were like Sudanese women. Some of them I think were Berber women. but they had these giant chunks of amber around their neck, like the size of like tennis balls. And it just really inspired me to start pushing scale and thinking about adornment. And they went from being like, my daughter was a model for them when she was like 8 or 9, and I would make them just to fit her, like dress up, and I'd take pictures with her with these, kind of probably the smallest would be like the size of like golf balls, and the largest would be the size of like navel oranges. And I would, adorn her, dress her up with these necklaces. And they went from being, 2.5 feet to 12 feet, in the last, I started making these around, I want to say like 2007. And this one here is from this year, what we're looking at now. Now
Okay.
they're not, yeah, now they're not like handmade. Now the components are made and they're slip cast. But the fun part of this is I can use this higher body fire clay, and the clay is much denser, but the stripes you see on those pieces are just from wrapping them with really coarse toilet paper and essentially burning that
Wow.
flame into the basically etching that smoke into each. And these are inspired by raptor claws. So getting back to my natural history roots, I have things made from tusks, bird skulls, a lot of different. When I first envisioned myself making necklaces, it was something I was like, I'm going to try to make a sculptural necklace. I thought about myself, Dimitri, like using those kinds of surfaces that were on my pots. But once I started making them, the repetition of negative spaces between these like little motifs was enough. Like I didn't think it was necessary to do surface work because the iteration of these forms and the color popping was enough. And the color got a lot more extreme, especially after I went to Uganda. Like I spent a little bit of time in Uganda a few years ago, and it was my first time on the continent. But just somehow my relationship to color changed. Like it was just between like the ebony black skin of people there and the dusty clay soil, like that orange clay kicked around, and the blue sky. I just felt like between those three things, all color that I saw was screaming. Like you see somebody like selling bananas on the corner, just green, 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 and it just just such a beautiful landscape of color that I experienced there. I just became so much more conscious of color. Maybe just because of the simplicity, a lot less brands and logos to compete with.
Sure. The light, I would say, yeah, I spent a year in Ghana, and I just say the light is just different. It's more intense, and folks are also not afraid of color, unlike here where we tend to grays and blues and
Yeah, it
be,
resensitized me to color. So, and the idea of like color kind of peering out. So seeing like like I mentioned that those bananas, like I'll never forget. It was just one guy selling green bananas, but they were it almost looked like somebody went on Photoshop and turned up the saturation, right? Wow, those bananas, like they're freaking fluorescent.
That's awesome. So I guess I'm actually popping back in time a little bit here, with
Yes. So that one was 2023 that you just, or 22. This one is 2017. And this one was reconfigured a little bit. I want to add that as these pieces got heavier and bigger, specifically the ones with glass that are even heavier, I had to find new structural ways of resolving them. So now all these big necklaces are reinforced with steel. So there's rubber, but under the rubber so it becomes a lot more sculpturally involved because I'm welding and tapping and grinding and bending this metal to conform to these shapes that I want, so that they're rigid, as opposed to like something that's just gonna droop, So that piece that you saw before, if you can go back, Dimitri, just one slide.
sure. Yeah.
that's designed to be that size. Because if it were just on like a string or a rope, everything would be the shape of a U.
Yeah, yeah.
For me to get that bowling ball pin shape or that round shape means that I have a 1/2 inch steel holding that weight under there.
Wow. And so so you're actually shaping it and torching it and bending it and welding it yourself. Wow.
It's
Okay.
important that that shape is held. So it's not just a round shape going around my daughter's neck. Now I have like a, you know, a very particular kind of space that I want to command with these.
Yeah, I love this idea of jewelry being larger than life size. Um,
And when I first started making these, I was making them in proximity specifically to brown female bodies. Like I like to kind of adorn my niece and my wife and my daughter. And then they started to transcend gender. Then they started to transcend like people. And I started to think of these as like celestial objects. Like what would a god wear? If the, you know, it's just, I know that sounds kind of deep, but like, I guess this gets into the Afrofuturist idea, like of like it being from something else, something beyond beyond comprehension.
Interesting. I love that. I love that idea. And it's also just elevating the object as it is. You know, the larger that it is, we start to pay attention to it in a different way than when it's in scale to a human body. And I think those are the things that really drew me to your work. The first time that I saw some of these is, you know, that reference to the jewelry. If you see a piece of jewelry, even without it being adorning someone's body, is referencing the body immediately. You know,
Yeah.
just because we know the function of it. Then when you start to put it into this huge scale, it makes me think. I'm not going to wax poetic about the things that it makes me think about because I'm going to leave that for other people. But you know, you're as you said, you're thinking about brown bodies, and you also blowing this up into larger than life scale. And I will leave it at that because I don't want to start plugging into all the ways that I think about the work and that I approach it and what it means to me. I'm going to leave that space for other folks.
And you see, my beard is a lot grayer since then.
It happens to all of us
It's
post
because
COVID.
my daughter had a baby, so that's what happened. She had a baby. I got gray right away. I think it was the anxiety. It's not just because I'm a grandpa.
I love it. I love it. You have to fit right into that role, right? Me and Tom, we got to get through these images here. You know, again, this one, I just, you know, I love the fact that this is an actual vessel. I saw a video of you actually pulling the head off. And so, you know, to know that amongst all of this, there's still this actual vessel that can hold something.
And ironically, this was the piece that that brother from the Congo liked the most. Like he really responded to this one. But this piece is larger than a beach ball. So it's really, really large. And then again, function is referenced, but not utilized.
Mm.
So this idea, and of course, you know that bird head comes off, it's a cork. So it's kind of like, well, what does it reference? What could it contain? You know, what is the mystery of that? It's some sort of vial, or what does it contain? What if there was a liquid? What kind of liquid would be in such a vessel?
Yeah, and I love this, you know, and I would love for you to kind of, you know, if you don't mind going into your, we've got the language of the Minkisi here, which, you know, working at MOAD is something we think about, you know, pretty frequently. And these, what is, do you mind sharing any of the things that you're referencing with that? When I think about the Minkisi, I think about them as, I know that they have multiple meanings, but I think about them as contracts, negotiations, agreements between folks, indicated by the nails being, hammered in when someone has a dispute or you want to make some kind of agreement that's binding beyond just the physical world. I would love to hear kind of your reference point for these objects.
Well, the thing I think about a lot, and I've said this in countless interviews, is there's art as noun and then there's art as verb. So you're looking at the product of an experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what is the experience? So my first encounter with an Nkisi sculpture was at the museum, and I was less than 10 years old. In fact, it was included in one of my solo shows recently, that very piece. And it was really nice to be reunited with this sculpture that kind of birthed so many different ideas. But I remember thinking about just what you're asking, like what does it mean? Or what is that doing? So to me, even like the process of me impaling this object this many times,
Mm-hmm.
like the kind of like modern reference I got is like when somebody says like, let's put a pin in that,
Mm-hmm.
right? What does that mean? Like, it means in some ways, like, this is important enough to come back to, but we can't cover everything at, like, we'll probably put a pin in a few things today. I hope you and I can,
for sure.
So there are things that we're touching on that we may not be able to take full responsibility for, right? Like kind of like that oath, right? I'm committed to revisiting this conversation with you, Dimitri, or picking back up on that topic. But also like this idea, just like my carving, you get into like a rhythm. And sometimes, I make a big giant vessel and I have somebody look at me and it's like, man, how obsessive. I can't believe you carved all that. Like, what were you thinking? What were you doing? And I'm like, it's just a bunch of I's and U's and H's and Y's. Like, it's not, it gets to the point where somebody can look at your handwriting and say the same thing. It becomes like a stream of consciousness, and it becomes just like a rhythm, right? So there are times where I'm making things and it's not about what it means, it's about how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's something that's also really important, at least to me, and I'm comfortable enough to say that now. I'm not a grad student who has to write a thesis, right? I could just say I'm jamming, right? And I don't have to have some expository explanation for what I'm doing. I'm doing something that feels right, right? And if I was doing a trumpet solo, it would be the same thing. Where did that come from? Is that riffing off of Miles? Is it riffing off of this concerto? Like sometimes you don't even know, it just comes out. But a lot of these Pierce pieces are very much about that. They're therapeutic, they're rhythmic. There is, there's a random repetition, which is very endemic to our continent, where we're finding order in chaos, and we have a way of being able to bring things together, just like a strip quilt, right? It's like they're dealing with a limited amount of information and somehow they resolve, right? Leave that piece out, add that piece in, and somehow it works. It's this, we call that, the Afro-Cobra would call that an improvisational aesthetic, right? It's
okay.
Right? Jeff Donaldson, James Phillips, Nelson, they're all, there's a different kind of rhythm, visual jazz. So I think about those things, just like I think about, Nkisi, and it's all ours, right? It belongs to me as much as jazz belongs to me.
Okay. I'm gonna jump through some images really quickly because I'm gonna end towards closer to where we are, because you're gonna show us some of the stuff in the studio, and I want to make sure we have time for that. So just bear with me. I want to talk about, just quickly, the Protest Shields series. And why don't we actually go to this one? Because
Yeah, so these I made during like the height of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I thought about like again, like riffing on something, like, wouldn't it be awesome to have some badass shields to like push back against the riot police with? And this was my vision. You know, they're obviously mask-like, but these things are huge. You know, they're big enough to cover your torso. So I thought about like what it would be like to create an object that had that kind of awe-striking power. You know, repetition on top of repetition, but also I wanted it to have a certain amount of like aggressiveness too. Hence the thorns and the fists and the prickers. So that's basically what these are about. I mean, me thinking about, you know, looking to the African lexicon to create an object that in some ways at least speaks to, this is just what was, you know, this is the context. This is what I was making during quarantine, during the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is what I was thinking about. Not what I was trying to do, but what I was thinking about.
What you were thinking about. I love it. I love it. And then, you know, I'm going to go into these amazing pieces. So some of your most recent ones. And I love that there's an image of someone staring at it so we could see this life-size scale.
Yeah. So the last 2 summers, I went away to the Archie Bray Foundation for Ceramic Art in Montana, in Helena, where they have big kilns and a clay mixer and a forklift that can bring me tons of clay directly from next door to really, really dig in. And, you know, I worked 18-hour days for about a month and I made 4 large scale figures. And then I went back, and this is something I always like to share. The second year I went back and my wife came with me, and she makes me take good care of myself. I don't want to say she takes care of me, but she, you know, kind of made sure I got sleep and got up for breakfast. And it's interesting, like the management of time. I was just as prolific working bank hours. I was working smarter. So the point is, you can dig in as much as you want, but eventually you'll hit the wall. So working 18-hour days, and then you wake up one day and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And then you got to start all over. And it's better to have like the slow and steady way. So, you know, we had dinner every night. I came home for lunch, and I was just as prolific with the second series during the second month. So I was there, I think June one summer and July the next summer. And these were just about me really thinking of scale and pushing these Nkisi inspired figures to the monumental. And essentially that's what they're about. I also want to add, and we'll talk about this and maybe some of the other pieces, but a lot of my works literally excavate my history as a maker, where you might see, you know, you might see a foot or a shard or a face or a fist in one of my pieces that could be 10 or 15 years old.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So there's like a shoebox here that says, you know, hands. And it just like, I was watching TV and I got inspired to make a bunch of clay hands and I didn't know what the hell to do with them. So I put them in the shoebox and they didn't turn out to be a part of a piece for 10 years. And that's
wow.
Or you know, I went back to visit my cousin's house, and in his basement, I used to work as a bachelor in the 90s, and I forgot that I left stuff back there, and now they're, you know, parts of new works. So I really find shards and old pieces and broken pieces and bring them back into the work. So for example, that snake that you see on the left, like an orange snake piece, that's from like 07. And
wow.
Back into the pieces.
That is incredible. I love that. So were these pieces already fired and then, you know, brought on, or have they just been sitting dry?
Yeah, they were fired and ready. And sometimes I break them up and sometimes I add them in. But yeah, I have stuff like that all around the studio.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. And then let's just go here because I want to make sure we have time to see what you've got going on in the studio before we have to leave.
So this one in the foreground was made the second summer. And the second summer I found out, because now we have all-wheel drive cars, like Montana, a snowy city, they had, you know, the junkyard had all these chains from back when they would put chains on car tires to get around in the snow. So I acquired all these chains and I started to integrate them the way that I think about them is like the chains are like, we still feel the weight of the chain. So the chain is not necessarily restricting you in the sense that it used to, but it's still restricting you. So I really have I really wanted to think about these pieces that were inspired by Nkisi that have like the chains bearing down on them, even if they are broken. So I have about 4 or 5 of these. They're slightly shorter than the ones from the prior summer. So the ones from the prior summer were like 5'7", 5'8", and these are more like elementary kid size.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hey, you were working smarter on this time.
And also a lot cheaper to ship, that's for sure.
Right. We've got a couple minutes, and I'm gonna turn off my camera. So if you wouldn't mind.
This thing where I said I would switch to my phone.
All
Testing,
right,
testing.
Can see, we can see, but I think you have to turn the volume off on the laptop.
How about now? You there?
That works.
Okay. So I said I was going to show you guys stuff. So what am I up to now? This is in progress, not finished. This is a new series I started. Wait, come on. I learn how to reverse my camera here. Got it. Okay, so this series is called Royals.
Wow.
And this is only a couple layers of color. I'm putting a lot more color into these, but they're, I think what I like about this is the way it sits. It kind of sits back. It has almost a little bit of attitude. But they're inspired by like these amphoric vessels because it has 2 handles, and this is obviously a lid as well. And these are inspired by, and I have another one here that's kind of going, but they're inspired by a wedding that I attended not long ago. And actually I conducted the wedding, and it was my niece who married a Nigerian man, but it was just the amount of color, like we were just talking about people not being afraid of color in that ceremony. We had traditional and non-traditional, people change clothes at weddings now, how that works. But
sure.
I really wanted to like, just to have like something regal, I guess is what I'm thinking about, something really having that power, that punch. So it not being so much browns and blacks. There's going to be more color in it yet, but this is like the second layer of color. I fired this multiple times. And then the other thing I worked on, and this is an interesting piece to me physically. This is one of those kiwi birds, like the one we just talked about.
Wow.
And I started this one in April of last year, the same time as I started the one that you had in the PowerPoint. And what's crazy about it is I preserved it. It was wet. And I was so busy for that whole time that I actually was able to pull off completing this piece, despite the fact that basically I had to keep it on ice, so to speak. Like I was out of town, I was out of the country. I called my son, asked him to unwrap it and spray it with water and wrap it back up. And just the idea that piece kind of waited for me.
Wow.
And I still able to pull it off. It's kind of a sentimental attachment. Last thing I'll show you that I have going on is this is a giant like mask shield piece, but this is maybe more interesting to me because of its technical aspects. But these are just porcelain thorns. I just had a bunch of these leftover porcelain that I kind of impaled this mask form with, but it's very large.
Oh, wow. It is very large. It's gorgeous.
Thank you. And lastly, this is kind of a signature piece for me, and I make them so much that I don't even put them out anymore because I don't want to like overextend them. but it's just one of these forms that I've always loved making, where I impel these with shards. And the bird is a recurring motif for me. And as someone said, it's like somewhere between the phoenix and the Sankofa bird. I think about both. I think about this omnipresence. Obviously this is like a third eye reference too, but this idea of facing both directions is important. So it's not just like one bird. I just always just found them formally very appealing, and a lot of just something that's just always been very intriguing to me. But I know we're running out of time, but that's the short of what I'm up to. I mean, so my hope is actually was saving these. I was eager to get them in the kiln, but I wanted you guys to see them first. So
that's incredible. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. We're so honored to be able to have that experience and to kind of see what you have building for us, and anticipating what's next for those. And speaking of that, what is next for you? Where can folks see your work next? And do you have any residencies coming up, or what's next on the horizon for you?
So at present, I have a solo show in Kansas City at the Belger Center, and that show is going to be up until August. So if you happen to be there, that show is going to go on. And, this is that season where like you have these proposals in for fairs that aren't official yet. You know what I'm saying? Like you might see me at this fair, you might see me at that fair, but it's, they're not official. But I'm working on a large scale commission and it's not approved, but it's kind of nodded, for a major museum in the South that I'm really excited about. And it's a piece that involves clay and glass. And I wish I actually could have showed that to you today, but it's this is kind of like old school African-American visual culture, the 70s wooden spoons, from the kitchen.
Sure, yes.
So I had a series of those that I casted in glass, like colored glass, and they're going to be a part of a major piece.
And for reference for folks, you're talking about those oversized spoons that we would have on our kitchen walls. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I think I know what you're talking about.
So if you can imagine those in like amber and like in burnt amber and honey yellow glass, transparent, and they're going to be incorporated. Like, and I know it's hard to picture, but those are going to serve as like braids on this large figure, because they have these very distinct kind of patterns on the handles of those. But that's probably the biggest project I'm involved in now. And I wish I could announce where it will be, but because the acquisition committee has to meet, blah, 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 how that stuff goes before things like that are public. But this is the first time in a while where I don't have like a show, although I have things in the, irons in the fire on the horizon. But I do have that show that's going to run through the summer, which is going to keep me busy for a while. And then, and I'm also going to the Wichita Museum. They just acquired a piece of mine, and that's on display in an exhibition called Heroes, Legends, and I want to say Heroes, Legends, and Icons. And it's with, I think Faith Ringgold is in that show, Vanessa German, and it's like, I can't think of who else is in the show. I wish I had it in front of me. But that's basically it. Hopefully one day I'll make it out to California.
Yes. We would love to have you here. I would love to be able to see that here. I see you have a piece in the Crocker Art Museum. So you've got one pretty close.
Yeah, that was fairly new. Now, let me ask you this. You know that movie Medicine for Melancholy?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the same museum, right?
That is the museum. The famous scene of them walking up the staircase is Moad.
Okay, so that's the closest I've ever gotten to Moad. So
awesome. Yeah, I think that film is coming up on its 15th anniversary. Or is it older than that today? I forget. maybe it's the 15th anniversary is coming up of that film. I was actually at the museum when I'm dating myself, but I was actually at the museum when they were filming the scenes.
Okay.
So if you want to know how long I've been connected with the museum, but yes, today said, please come and join us, Sharif. We would love to have you and host you at MOAD. Thank you so much for this conversation today and your generosity with time and showing us around your studio. I am excited to see your work at all of these locations. And today I'm going to put you out since today has a Kansas City connection. So, you know.
Go check out the show. It's up for a while, all the way till August. So go out and see the show. And thank you guys for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate talking to you.